Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Martin. Thank you for coming. Nice to be back in a really full lecture theatre after the last 18 months or so. Now, this morning, you all did something which was sort of fundamental to the nature of the human condition. You made a transition from being unconscious into being conscious, and we do this every single day when we wake up. And yet, we don't really know what that means. We don't really understand what the transition from unconsciousness to consciousness how that actually transpires. Consciousness is, of course, one of the sort of central ideas that has been driving at least Western thought for the last several thousand years, mostly the preserve of philosophers and artists. And as ever in all these sorts of subjects, scientists don't like to be left out, and so in the last few years, scientists have really had a crack at this. Now, what that means is that in subjects particularly where you could describe them as being opinion-rich and data-poor, there's been a lot of very bad work on consciousness in the scientific and philosophical domains in the last few years. I'm just going to quote from the speaker tonight. This was said by a leading psychologist from Cambridge when he went to become an undergraduate there in 1989. He said, "Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written on it." Thank you for coming. No, that's a joke. Professor Anil Seth, he's a professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex, has written this fantastic book called Being You, which I think is destined to really be a classic. Anil, it really is one of the clearest thinkers fusing philosophy and neuroscience and computational models to try and really get at what has been described as the hard problem of consciousness, what it is to be us, but I think is better described by his own coinage, which is the real problem of consciousness. As ever with these talks, Anna's going to talk for around about an hour, and then we're going to have half an hour of questions from you, the audience. We don't have roving mics, so you're going to have to put your hand up and shout, and I'll repeat the questions. And we've got something like 1,000 people watching at home, so I'll be monitoring the chat. Please keep it polite, and asking questions from the internet as well. That's it from me. All that remains is for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Anil Seth.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks, Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow, there's real people. Real people. Amazing. So I don't know much about Being You, but being me feels really strange right now. I haven't been to a lecture, let alone deliver a lecture, for more than 18 months. And but here we are. Here I am in this beautiful, storied building with wonderful people at the launch of my own book, and it feels very disconcerting, but it also does feel quite good. Am I the same person that I was 2 years ago? I mean, how could I be? I've spent the last 18 months at home pretty much on my own. And this isn't my house, by the way. But that's been a radical disruption of the flow of events and social interactions that normally defines my life. It seems to me that I am the same person. There seems to be this strong continuity between myself then and myself now. And that continuity in the sense of self, that's a large part of what being anyone, being me, being you, is all about. Now, there's a well-known phenomenon in the science of perception called change blindness. And while I've been talking, the image behind you in the background has slowly been changing. How many of you noticed the change? I'm hoping some of you did. I'm hoping the people from my lab noticed the change. Did they? I can't tell. Can't see them. They're here. Not so many of you, but a lot of things have changed in that image. This is from a colleague of mine, Michael Cohen, in the US. This is how it started. And this is how it ended up. I still don't know how many things changed in that image. This is a classic demonstration. Lots of things change. How it started, how it's going, how it started, how it's going. Your perception changed, but you did not perceive the change. That's what change blindness reveals. It reveals that change is not just something that happens to perception. Change is part of perception. We perceive change in the same sort of way that we perceive color, shape, smell, other things in the world around us. Now, I think the same thing applies to the experience of being a self, of being any self. In fact, it applies even more so, and I call this self-change blindness in the book. Our brains and our minds are geared by evolutionary design to perceive ourselves as changing less than we actually do, because we perceive ourselves in order to control ourselves, in order to stay alive. The experience of being me or being you is a kind of controlled hallucination designed to keep the body going, designed to keep us alive. The sort of key message in the book and in this talk is that we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. This is the center of what in the book I call this idea, theory, proposal of the beast machine. That we have conscious minds and sentient selves because of and not in spite of our nature as living machines. So the challenge on the table, and the challenge that motivated this idea, and the challenge about which nothing worth reading has been yet written, maybe, is that of understanding consciousness, of understanding this relationship between a physical material system, such as a brain and a body, and the private, intrinsically subjective and big and beautiful world of subjective experience, and of being a self within it. How does that happen? Well, as always, it's best to start with a definition. And my favorite working definition of consciousness comes from the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who said that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. There's something it's like for that organism to exist. There's something it's like to be me. There's something it's like to be you. There's probably something it's like to be an elephant or a bat or a kangaroo. But there's probably nothing it's like to be a table, a chair, a laptop computer, or a glass of water. There's nothing going on for those systems. That's all consciousness experience is. It's also important to say what it is not. Consciousness is not the same thing as just sensitivity to the environment. This Venus flytrap is going about its business without anything going on for it. There's no need to assume that there's consciousness happening for this plant. It's not the same thing as intelligence. When AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol back in 2016, there was no need for it to be aware of what it was doing. It's a very complicated machine learning program. It doesn't have to be conscious. It's not the same as agency. These people at Boston Dynamics keep building these incredibly scary robots that give the impression of executing very complex goal-directed behavior. But again, there's no inner light. There's nothing in a universe for one of these systems. A little bit more contentiously, when we think about human consciousness, certainly I don't think that consciousness is the same as having the fully reflective self, the self that means that you know that you are conscious, you know your name, and so on. That's something that's a bit extra. Conscious experience is just the presence of any experience at all. In fact, you can think of it as the space in which all experiences appear. And then comes the question again, how does that happen? How does consciousness relate to this mess of electrochemical wetware inside our skulls? Faced with this problem, it seems almost difficult that it could be solved by science at all. And in fact, the philosopher David Chalmers has put it very strongly with his famous or now infamous hard problem of consciousness. He puts it like this. He says that it is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. The intuition driving this is that even if you solved what Chalmers calls the easy problems, and these are the problems basically, how does the brain work as a mechanism? How do all its complex circuits take input and deliver output, guide our behavior, implement memory, all these things? Even if we solve all of those, the hard problem of why there's anything going on in consciousness would remain pristine and untouched. It would get us nowhere. That's the intuition. Now, faced with the hard problem, some people, some thinkers have lurch to apparently quite radical approaches or potential solutions. We have panpsychism. Consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. It's spread out in the universe like a thin layer of jam. This is panpsychism. This is like the problem with panpsychism is not that it seems crazy. The problem is that it explains nothing, it can't be tested, and it doesn't lead to testable predictions. I don't like it very much, as you can probably tell. At the other extreme, there are certain views that say, oh no, actually, we're completely mistaken about this sense of mystery when it comes to consciousness. There's nothing really mysterious at all. It's just mechanism. That's all there is. Consciousness doesn't really exist, at least not how we normally think of it. Now, I think of this position, it's a bit like a medicine. If you take the right amount of it, it's very useful because it opens up a little gap between how things seem to you and how you might understand things actually are. But if you take too much of it and think that, no, consciousness doesn't exist, well, that's a place I don't want to go because consciousness, I think, for me, for most of us, is actually all there is. Without consciousness, there's nothing at all. So my approach, and it's not only mine, I just sort of call it this way, it's the approach of, I think, most people working in this area, is called the real problem of consciousness. You take the bull by the horns. Consciousness exists, recognize its intimate dependence on the brain and the body, and try to figure out what's going on. And the particular way that I like to try to do this is to try and ask how mechanisms and processes in the brain and body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness. And these can be both functional, like what can we do because we're conscious? When I'm conscious, I can do various things. I can have I see this glass of water and I can drink from it, I can ignore it, I can throw it over my shoulder. There are things I can do in virtue of being conscious, but there's also a phenomenology to it. There's something it is like to have a visual experience that's different from what it's like to have an emotional experience or a smell, to experience a smell. If you explain, predict these properties, then you're getting somewhere in a science of consciousness. This is neither the hard problem, because it's not trying to answer the question of how you magic experience out of mere mechanism. And it's not the easy problem either, because you're not just explaining the brain as a machine and sweeping conscious experience away under the carpet. It has many answers. There's many other similar traditions. I just want to not pretend that it's completely new, not at all. I'm very influenced by this thing called neurophenomenology associated with the Chilean neuroscientist Francisco Varela, who died 20 years ago. Similar idea. And the underlying intuition is that this way, instead of solving Chalmers' hard problem, we dissolve it. And there's a historical analogy for this, which I find a little bit useful, which is sort of fading into view now. Not that long ago, scientists, biologists, chemists were perplexed about how science could explain life. Life seemed to be something beyond what could be explained in terms of mechanisms. This, of course, led to vitalism, this idea that we needed an élan vital, a spark of life. Now, we don't think of it this way at all. There's no need for that hypothesis of a special source. And my hope and belief, actually, is that the same thing will apply to consciousness. Instead of treating it as one big, scary mystery in need of one humdinger eureka moment of a solution, by examining its properties, separating them out, looking at them, explaining them in turn, we will dissolve the hard problem of consciousness just as the hard problem of life was dissolved in the past. Now, life is not the same thing as consciousness. This is certainly very true. And I think one of the most important differences between life and consciousness is you can't really put a conscious experience on the table and look at it. Conscious experiences are intrinsically subjective. They exist for the organism having them. This is a problem. It makes consciousness hard to study. How do you get the right kind of data? But it doesn't make a science of consciousness impossible, as some people sometimes claim. It just means it's quite challenging. You can still get data about what people's experiences are like, and you can try, predict, explain, control. So just as in the study of life, people identified different properties that living systems have, things like reproduction, homeostasis, metabolism. We can do the same thing with consciousness. It's not just one big thing. We can think of it in several different ways. And the ways that in the book and in my work with my lab in Sussex, We focus on different aspects. There's conscious level. How conscious are you when you're conscious? Broadly, the difference between being under anesthesia and being awake and aware, as you are now. Then there's conscious content. When you're conscious of something. Right now, you're conscious of my voice and of this slightly strange experience of being surrounded by lots of people. But there are colors, shapes, sounds, the feeling of your body against the chair. Those are the contents of your experience. And especially the last one is related to a very important, for many of us, and certainly for me, the most essential aspect of conscious content, which is the experience of being a self, the experience of being you. So let's start. I'm going to rattle through a few things about each of these domains of consciousness. And we'll start with conscious level. What in the brain explains the difference between being awake and aware and just being a chunk of living meat without anything going on for you? The first thing to say about this is that conscious level is not the same thing as wakefulness. Now, normally they go together, right? You can go to sleep and you might lose consciousness a bit, and you wake up and you come around. But there are occasions where the two dissociate. When you are asleep and you're having dreams, of course, you're conscious when you're dreaming. Dreams are conscious. But you're asleep. And on the other side, there are states such as the vegetative state or the unaware wakeful state, where people after severe brain injury go through cycles of sleep and wake, but there doesn't seem to be anything going on. There doesn't seem to be anybody at home. There seems to be no consciousness happening. So consciousness is not the same thing as wakefulness. So what we need to do is ask what in the brain goes along with consciousness and not just with wakefulness. And among many different approaches to this, and it's cut a long story very short, I'll just tell you about one approach that we've been following in the lab and now with colleagues in Cambridge and London who are here, Dan and Pedro and Fernando and so on, Tristan. We use this measure called Leverhulme complexity. This is basically, it's very simple really, it sounds complicated, but it's really the same thing that takes a digital photo and compresses it into a short file that you can send by email. And it does this basically by counting the number of repeated patterns in a photo or in any kind of data. And it looks at how many patterns, I'll ask questions about that later, complicated thing at the bottom. But basically it's just saying how many different combinations of ones and zeros are there in any data set. Count the number of those, the library that you need to recreate the original, and that's the Leverhulme complexity. Broadly, you can think of it as the higher it is, the more diverse, the more patterns there are in the data that you're looking at. And if you apply this measure to data from the brain rather than to a photo, you see some interesting things. This is work with Adam Barrett and Michael Shartner at Sussex and our collaborators. Under anesthesia, the complexity level goes down when you lose consciousness. Your brain becomes more regular, more predictable as you lose consciousness. The same happens in sleep. This is another data set where we recorded, or colleagues recorded from electrodes planted deep into the brain. What's interesting here, I wonder if this is going to work. You can sort of see, oh yeah, look at that. That's clever. You can see here that wakeful rest and rapid eye movement, REM sleep, are basically the same patterns there, which means that this measure is the same for the stage of sleep when you're likely to be conscious and dreaming than when you're awake and aware. But in other stages of sleep, I'm going to do this all the time now, it's much lower. And then finally, and what was quite a surprising finding, when we applied the same measure with colleagues in Imperial to data from people in the psychedelic state, whether it was LSD here, but also psilocybin or ketamine, it goes the other way. The brain becomes more diverse, more unpredictable in the psychedelic state. This was often written up in the media as scientists discover evidence for a higher state of consciousness, which is not really what we were trying to say. There's something measurable in the brain dynamics, though, that is characteristic of the psychedelic state, which was interesting. Now, these are a first step towards tracking the neural fingerprints of conscious level in the brain, but it doesn't necessarily explain anything about why that happens, why that should be the case. And so to bring you kind of up to where we are with this sort of work, it's trying to develop measures based on this idea, but that actually give us a principled reason for why they should go along with consciousness. And this is based back in work that actually first really inspired me to do consciousness science as a career, try and get into it anyway. Back in the late 1990s, I was doing my PhD, and I read these papers by Gerald Edelman, who became my boss in San Diego, and Giulio Tononi, one of his protégés, who's now a real leading figure in the field. And they had this idea that every conscious experience that you have has two properties. It's both integrated, it's all of a piece. Like there's nothing, experiences, bits of them don't go on separately from other bits. Right now, it's all happening in one unified scene, but it's also very informative. So every conscious experience that you have rules out the simultaneous occurrence of a vast repertoire of alternative possible experiences that you could have. It's, in a very strictly technical way, it's informative. It's reducing the uncertainty in the space of all the experiences you could have. These are two very distinctive things about consciousness that don't apply or don't readily apply to other things about biology that we might want to explain. So we want measures in the brain that reflect these two properties at the same time, that capture this middle ground between information and integration. And this is something we've been working on in other groups too for a number of years now, and this is still at the level of just developing the actual measures. And again, these are the last equations, the only equations are going to appear in the whole talk, and they're not particularly relevant. It's just to show that there are ways now to write down things that capture this middle ground, and the idea is we can go and test these measures on data from the brain and see how they behave. Right now, they don't behave as nicely as the simpler measures, so there's still a lot of work to do. And one of the things that we're moving on to, and this is the last thing I'll say about level, is to build also measures that capture emergence. This is another super interesting, quite controversial, quite difficult to define phenomenon in which a bunch of parts, like in this case, a flock of starlings, the flock seems in some way to have a life of its own. It seems to be more than the sum of the individual birds that make it up. We all recognize when it happens in a situation like this, but it's surprisingly difficult to figure out how you mathematically figure out where and when it's happening in other systems. Like, if your neurons are firing in complicated ways, how do you know whether it's sort of like a flock of birds or not? It's quite a difficult question to ask. So with Lionel Barnett and Fernando Rosas and other people here, we've been trying to develop ways of quantifying that and see if that can act as also a measure of conscious level. Okay, so this is a whistle-stop tour through these things, so I'm going to move swiftly on to conscious content. The question of how our conscious experience comes to be populated by all the different things that it is at any particular time, the objects, people, places, colors, shapes, and so on. And here's another demonstration to get down from the heady heights of equations and so on. Oops, I don't know if you've seen this before. Is it actually working? Let me see. Yeah, there we go. What I'd like you to do is focus your eyes on the black cross at the center of this image, and just try not to move your eyes and try not to blink. I'm going to do it too, but it's a bit difficult from here. Now, without moving it, just how many people see that the magenta patches have disappeared? And the green patch is that this is the kind of thing you couldn't do on Zoom all last year, just like actually ask people questions. It's brilliant, I love it. So now blink and move your eyes and have a look around. Of course, the magenta patch has come back, there is no green patch. This is called a lilac chaser illusion. And what's actually happening here is a few different things. There's something called Troxler fading. When things with indistinct edges are at the periphery of your vision, they tend to just disappear from your experience. There's also apparent motion when things change on and off near each other. The brain infers motion between them. And there's color opponency, the opposite. The brain has a color space, and the opposite in color space to magenta is green. And the reason for that actually is kind of interesting, because you make magenta by mixing red and blue light, but if you think about the electromagnetic spectrum, red and blue and green is in the middle, red and blue on the edges. So if the brain gets red and blue, it's sort of expecting the green cells to be activated too, but they aren't because you're only mixing red and blue. So magenta is sort of not green. So when you're seeing the green after image, what you're really seeing is not green. Okay? Good. So the way to understand that piece of nonsense is that your brain is a prediction machine. You know, there is this gap. You can already see there's this gap between how things are and what you experience. And the idea that I've been running with is that this happens because the brain is always making sense, trying to make sense of what's essentially noisy and ambiguous and uncertain data. Now imagine being a brain for a second. Imagine that you're stuck inside this bony vault of your skull trying to figure out what's out there in the world. Now there's no sound in the skull, there's no light in the skull, it's dark, it's silent. All you've got to go on are these electrical signals which are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be. So perception has to be this process of inference, of best guessing, where the brain combines this soundless, colorless, uncertain sensory information with its prior expectations, its prior knowledge about the way the world really is. And that's what we consciously see. We see the brain's best guess of what's out there. That's a very sort of abstract, high-level description of what's going on. There is another equation, damn it, I forgot that one. What this translates to, if you think, what does this actually mean for the brain? It means the brain is doing something called Bayesian inference. And Bayesian inference is a very old idea in probability and statistics and mathematics. It's sort of reasoning under conditions of uncertainty. You know, everything is uncertain. We can use Bayesian statistics to figure out what might be happening in the pandemic, to try and locate a missing submarine. It's sort of reasoning backwards from the effects to what you think caused those effects. Like in this case, the effects are the sensory signals that hit our eyes and our ears, and the causes are what's out there in the world that gave rise to those sensory signals. Now, actually, it's usually very complicated to do for anything, to write it down, do it at a computer, to get any machine or anything to do Bayesian inference is really complicated. But one way to do it, one way to at least get an approximation to it, is to do this thing called predictive processing. And this is the idea that this is what the brain is doing when it's making a best guess. And the reason it's doing it is because it's a way of doing Bayesian inference to try and figure out what caused its sensory environment. And the idea of predictive processing is very simple. It's that you have signals going in both directions in the brain. One direction is from the outside in, from the world deeper and deeper into the brain. And the other direction is the other direction, from the inside out, from the brain back out to the senses and back out to the world. And if you take the inside-out signals and think of those as the predictions, those are the predictions about what's going on. And the outside-in signals, what's coming in and percolating upwards through the brain, those are just the prediction errors. Those are just telling the brain the difference between what it's expecting and what it's getting. And by continually trying to minimize these prediction errors, get rid of them, update its predictions, or change the data to get rid of prediction errors, these predictions collectively settle on the brain's best guess of what's out there, and that turns out to be very close to what Bayesian inference is. But beyond that sort of nice mathematical equivalence, there's a real conceptual message here, which I still find quite puzzling to think about. I mean, we're so used to thinking that perception is this process of just reading out sensory signals. It seems as though the world pours itself into our minds through the transparent windows of our senses. But it's the other way around. What we perceive is coming from the inside out, and the sensory data is just keeping our perceptual best guesses in check. So perceptual content is conveyed by the top-down predictions, and bottom-up sensory signals just convey the prediction errors. So the green arrows are the important ones there. Skip this, we don't need that. Now, if you start asking, well, what's the evidence for any of this kind of proposal? There's some, and we've done some of it in the lab. This is an old study now with a former postdoc of mine, Yaya Pinto, what we do here is we show different images to each eye. So in one eye might see an image of a face that gradually appears, and the other eye might initially see this changing pattern of colored blocks, which gradually fades away. And if you show them to separate eyes, the brain, instead of combining them into some sort of mess, it starts off with the most dominant, so you just see the changing colors. And then after a while, the face breaks through, and that's what you see. So a prediction you can make is that, well, if perception is conveyed mainly by the predictions, by what the brain is expecting, then if you cue the person the word face to expect a face, then they should see a face more quickly and more accurately than when they're not expecting it. And that's what we see in the data. So people see more accurately and more quickly what they're expecting to see compared to what they're not expecting to see. But that's sort of psychophysics that you can do in the lab, and it's fine, but it's not really getting us that close to what our lived experience, this rich panorama of perceptual experience is like. So to do that, one of the things we're doing in the group now, I like to call it, it's a bit of a mouthful of a term, I know that, but I like to call it computational neurophenomenology. I mean, I really should call it something else. But this is just the idea of using computational models to try and build this bridge between what's happening in the brain and what our experiences are like. And we're doing this at the moment by focusing on unusual experiences. Like, a good way to understand the system in general is to look at it when you push it, and so it's behaving a bit differently from normal. And in particular, in vision, we have this phenomenon of something like hallucination. Now, this is a picture of a face in a cloud. We're all familiar with this in some ways. We see faces in clouds, we can see faces in pieces of toast, we can see faces in basically anything. The brain is strongly wired to be sensitive to see faces. We can even see faces in churches. And so what's going on here, this suggests the brain has a strong prediction about faces. So can we then understand, can we try and simulate that somehow, and this balance? What happens when you turn up the predictions a bit? And so this is quite old work now with Keisuke Suzuki and others in the lab, where we took one of these very well-known neural networks. This is just a neural network that takes images and tells you what's in them. All the information flows from the image upwards, but you can turn it the other way around, and you can fix the output and basically say something like dog, and then run it backwards and change the image. So in that case, what you're doing is you're projecting a prediction into a pre-existing image. And if you do that, and we did this in a panoramic video and replayed it through a headset, so people can put a headset on and look around, and what they see is a world suffused by dogs and dog parts. And we called this the hallucination machine. And if you actually look at it through a headset, it's surprisingly compelling. And it's not, some people say it's a little bit trippy here and there. It's probably not, but it's definitely unusual, and there's something going on. It's not just dogs photoshopped onto this image. There's dogness emerging from the image in all sorts of interesting ways. And so this is what happens this is a simulation of what happens if your brain has overly strong predictions to see dog. So what we're doing now, just again, whiz through, so bring up we're sort of taking this further and trying to simulate different kinds of hallucinations. Now, hallucination is a complicated concept. Lots of people have lots of different kinds. In particular, people with Parkinson's disease or certain kinds of dementia can have very complex hallucinations where there's complete scenes and people and objects and places. Other kinds of hallucinations can be very simple, patterns and shapes, and nothing more than that. So we have now a more sophisticated set of neural networks that we wire up in all sorts of different ways. And what we can do is now simulate different kinds of hallucinations. So what you see here, each of these images is like a starting point. There's a bird, a mushroom, a lamp, a volcano, and a thing. Oh, that was a flower of some sort. And the second row down, it's a bit blurry, and that's deliberate. What we're simulating there is hallucinations that happen when people lose central vision. Happens in something called Charles Bonnet syndrome. And if we run the system, you see that we end up with very different kinds of hallucinations in each of these cases. So this is now where we can just get a bit more specific about the mechanisms that underlie different kinds of perceptual experience. And I think that is getting us a bit closer to understanding how experiences are constructed in our own brains. We're also closing the loop on this by finding people with these conditions who experience these hallucinations in real life and just asking them to sort of match the output of the model to what they encounter in their daily lives, so we can calibrate what we're doing against what people actually experience. So this way of thinking leads to the idea that hallucination is a kind of uncontrolled perception. It's what happens when the normal business of inferring what's out there, of balancing perceptual predictions against prediction errors, goes off the rails a bit. And in turn, what that means, to me anyway, and I first heard this phrase from Chris Frith, who heard it from somebody else who've never been able to find out where it originally came from, is that perception is a kind of controlled hallucination. Now, this is often misinterpreted as saying that perception, as a claim that perception has nothing to do with the outside world, that everything is made up. That, go and stand in front of a bus, people tell me, and see if you still think perception's a hallucination. It's like, no, the control is just as important here. The way we perceive things is reined in by the world in all sorts of interesting and useful ways for the organism. But I like this phrase because it just underlines a continuity. Hallucination is not a completely different species. It's the same underlying process. It's just the balance between predictions and prediction errors has gone. The brain's best guesses have lost their grip on the world, and people see things that other people don't. Now, in the book, I try and take this idea much further than just seeing dogs on Sussex campus or seeing a face more quickly. And the larger claim here is that this way of thinking applies to all of our experience, all of the time. It applies to experiences of color, of sound, of touch, taste, but also more fundamental things like our sense of time and duration, whether a visual impression feels like an object or not. And ultimately, whether things somehow seem real. Even that is an aspect of perceptual inference, this experience that we have that what we perceive really exists. That too, just like change, is another aspect of perception. The image in the back was trying to just give a feeling of like a real-world experience. This was one of the few summer days in Brighton that was beautiful out on the water. And the next part, and for me the most interesting, is when you take these ideas and turn them inwards to the self. And to recognize that the self is also a form of perception. Now, it's quite natural to think, maybe, that the self is the thing that does the perceiving, that you have a world out there, that sensory data comes from the world, there's a self that's somehow the recipient of this data that forms perceptions that reflect the way the world is. But it's not really like that. I don't think it's like that at all. The self itself is another form of perception. It's another kind of controlled hallucination, but a very special one, because it's the experience of being you. Now, the first implication of this is, again, not a new thing. It's just the self is not one thing. This is another little division between how things seem and how things are. So it might seem to us in our normal lives, unless we are suffering a kind of mental illness of some sort or something, that the experience of being a self is unified. There's just you, and you go along from place to place or Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, and it's the same you that's there all along for the ride all the time. But there are many ways in which we all experience being a self. There's the bodily self, the experience of being a body, just being alive and identified with this thing in the world, this object that is your body. There's a place where your body ends and the rest of the world begins. There's the experience of perceiving the world from a first-person perspective, somewhere behind your eyes, maybe. We know this can go away because people report things like out-of-body experiences where they see themselves from an external perspective. There's the volitional self, the experience of making actions, deciding to do something, being the cause of things that happen in the world. People often think free will is related to this. We can talk about free will later. It's a bit of a rabbit hole. And then finally, there's higher levels of self. There's something like the narrative self, where self becomes associated with a set of memories, with a persistent identity over time, a name. And then there's the social self, This thing I think many of us have been missing, this part of us that depends on being with others. Part of what it is to be me is refracted through the minds of the people that I know, that I interact with. And all of these different aspects of self all seem to be bound together, all seem to be part of a piece. But they can come apart in all sorts of ways, and we know this from, especially, I think, the writings of people like Oliver Sacks are beautiful illustrations of what happens when one part of the self is changed, but the other parts might remain. In the book, I talk about a person called Clive Wearing. Clive Wearing is a musicologist, and he had a very, very severe form of amnesia, a very severe brain disease, which led to one of the most dramatic and profound amnesias, losses of memory that's ever been recorded. He could not remember anything new. He lived in what was called a permanent present tense of about 10 seconds for years. I mean, he's in his 80s now. This happened in the 80s. But the rest of him is still there. And there was I never met him, I knew this secondhand, but there was this famous event where he went back to a choir that he used to direct, and he was able to direct the music with a fluency that made him seem whole again. I think it's a wonderful story. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the bodily self. This is where we've done, I think, the most, my interests have focused in our groups. This is the experience of both identifying with this object in the world that is your body, and a more basic experience of just being a living organism without shape or form. Now, the idea, of course, is that these experiences of having and being a body are perceptual constructions, are brain-based best guesses, just like everything else. And there's a very famous illustration of this, which I think many of you might have seen, called the rubber hand illusion. And what happens in the rubber hand illusion is that a volunteer, in this case the guy in blue, hides his real hand is hidden behind a partition. He can't see it. And a fake rubber hand is placed in front of him, which he can see. Then the experimenter, the guy in green, takes 2 paintbrushes and strokes both hands simultaneously. And what happens for many people, not for everybody, but what happens for many people when you do this, is that they report this somewhat uncanny feeling that the fake hand is sort of something maybe a bit like part of their body. Not completely, but maybe a little bit. And if you stroke them out of time, that doesn't happen. So this has been, in fact, I use this in a lot of talks, I used to, as a fantastic example of the brain making a best guess about what is and what is not its body. You can just see it happen here. I forgot to start the movie. It's always fun to look at. There, they're stroking it, and there's a way to test whether it's actually worked, which is to use a kitchen implement. So yes, it worked. Look at that. So there's a sort of nice story here where you can think that the brain is getting evidence that all this sensory information is coming. I see it, the brain is seeing a hand, it's feeling touch, the hand looks roughly like a hand, is where a hand should be. So it's making its best guess. Now, this might be part of the story, but one of the fascinating lines of work that's been happening at Sussex, especially led by my colleagues Pete Lush and Zoltan Dienes, is that that's not the whole story. In fact, that might not be part of the story at all. Pete embarked on the world's largest rubber hand study, probably, a couple of years ago, doing the rubber hand illusion on about 400 undergraduates in these kind of rubber hand factory farms that were set up at Sussex at the beginning of the pre-pandemic academic year. So we did the rubber hand illusion on a whole bunch of people, but at the same time also measured something called suggestibility. Now, you've all heard of hypnosis, right? And hypnosis isn't just stage trickery. We all differ in how suggestible we are. There's a tendency we all have that if somebody encourages us to do something or to expect something to happen or to experience something, if we're highly suggestible, we'll be more likely to do that thing or have that experience. And it's a very stable trait. And it turns out that this correlates quite strongly with the rubber hand illusion. So you can see that line, that's not a statistically appropriate, that's just a line I photoshopped on to the graph from the paper, just it goes up that way. But basically, the more suggestible you are, the stronger the rubber hand illusion is. Now, those two color bars here, because that's comparing when you stroke in time and out of time, and you might say, aha, but there's still a big difference. Well, yes, but in fact, and this is other important work that Pete's done, people expect there to be a difference. If you just tell people what you're going to do in the rubber hand illusion, say, I'm going to stroke your hands either in time or out of time, what do you expect to feel? People know what they should experience. And so it's actually no surprise that there's always a difference between them. In psychology, this is the very old issue of demand characteristics that we always worry about. How do we control for what people expect to happen? Because people doing psychology experiments are really annoying. They always try to figure out what you want to happen and either do that or more likely do the opposite. But all this is part of the same thing. It's saying that what we experience is still this construction, but there are many different factors now. There's not just the sensory data. There's all the things that the brain is bringing to that context to expect. Okay, now in the last bit of the talk, I want to talk about not the experience of the body as an object, but the experience of just being a body, this basic basal ground state of what it feels like to be alive. And I call this idea of being a beast machine, which I'll explain why in a little bit. So having a body is one thing. And by the way, there is something really distinctive about that. In other cases, we know from lots of neurological cases, there are cases like there's this thing called somatoparaphrenia, where people who've had a specific kind of brain damage, they will experience their real limb, they still have maybe a right arm, they will experience it as belonging to somebody else. And that experience is held really powerfully. They will try and throw themselves out of bed. They just do not believe it's their arm, even when you point out that it's joined to their shoulder. So that's the sort of strength of experience that you never get in something like the rubber hand illusion. So it's this body ownership thing it's fundamental to the self. But there's also this experience of just being a living organism. And we don't think about this quite so much, or at least I didn't used to think about this so much, but I think it's really at the bottom of what being you is all about. And it highlights another form of perception. We're very used to thinking of perception as something that's mainly about the outside world. You open your eyes, you can listen, it's figuring out what's out there in the world. But there's a whole variety of perception called interoception, and this is about the brain perceiving and regulating the interior of the body. If you think about, again, what it's like to be a brain, it's got no direct access to anything, whether it's in the world or in the body. All it gets is sensory signals, electrical signals. They don't come with labels like, oh, I'm from the heart, I'm from the kidneys. It doesn't work like that. So this concept of interoception refers to all the various ways that the brain senses its own physiological condition. And if you think about it, that's fundamentally what brains need to do. They're not there to write poetry, however nice that is, or figure out marketing plans for the following quarter. They're there to keep the body alive. But how do they do that? Well, it's faced with the same problem. There's no direct access, so this perception of the body from the inside follows the same principles. At least this is what I think is going on, that it follows these principles of prediction and prediction error. But now this dance between prediction and prediction error is unfolding primarily within the body itself. This is this concept of interoceptive inference. And there's one crucial difference between perceiving the body from within and perceiving things out there in the world, like this glass of water, which is that interoceptive predictions, these perceptions, predictions about the body, they're not about finding things out, they're much more about controlling things. So what matters about the state of my body from the brain's perspective is not where my lungs and kidneys are and what shape they are, what color they might be, but how well they're doing their job at keeping me alive, now and in the future. Whereas when I perceive the outside world, ultimately that's what it's for too. My vision works ultimately in the service of me staying alive, but more immediately, I need to know where things are. Is it coming towards me? Is it going away? Is it going to eat me? Whatever. So interoceptive predictions are basically doing a fundamentally different thing, and I think that underlies why the perceptions of the body from within feel very different. They have a very different character than experience of the world around us. When we think about experience of the world around us, it's objects and places and people and things and smell. But these embodied experiences, emotions and moods, things feel good or bad, or more likely to be good in the future, or more likely to be bad in the future. I mean, that's a pretty limited view of emotion, but it kind of comes down to that. Things are ultimately good or bad in some way. Now, this idea, it brings together, and in the book we go into this a bit more, is that it brings together a lot of different ways of thinking about the brain. There's this very, I think for me, hugely exciting but much overlooked tradition called cybernetics. Back in the 1950s, when people were first thinking about computers, they weren't only thinking about computers to play chess or to play Go or do reasoning. There was another completely integrated at the time line of thinking about systems that could control things like, it was just after the war, so things like radar and guiding missiles were critical. And this idea that a good control system has to have tightly coupled feedback. It has to be very sensitive to error, prediction error. And it also has to have a model of the system it's controlling. It has to be able to make predictions about it. It needs to know what's going to happen to it in the future. So the idea is that any control system worth its salt in a complex situation is going to involve this process of prediction. Now, your central heating system at home, or air conditioning system for the audience in America, can work very simply. Like if it's too cold, it comes on. If it's too hot, it turns off. But when it comes to something like the body, it's not enough to do that. You don't want to wait until your heart rate has gone through the roof before you decide to try and dilate your blood vessels or do some other thing, or your brain decides to do that. You have to predict in advance in order to keep things stable. In physiology, this is called allostasis, achieving stability through change. So this idea has a very long provenance that motivates this idea of predictive perception from the perspective that that's how the brain controls things. This reaches, I think, its sort of most fully elaborate and beautiful apogee in this idea of the free energy principle, which was developed by Carl Friston, who's also here. And this is the idea that organisms, especially organisms, but basically things, anything that counts as a thing, maintains itself over time, doesn't dissipate into nothing. In organisms or things that maintain themselves over time, just think about like a fish. A fish swimming around in the water, it remains being a fish because it's in the water. If you take a fish out of water and put it on a table, it'll dissolve into mush after a while. Living systems in particular maintain themselves in states they expect to be in the long run. They try and stay in a very small repertoire of possible states they could inhabit. I am not turning into mush, and my brain's job is basically to try and keep myself in this very small state of all the possible states I could be in, most of which would be mush. And it turns out this very basic imperative just to remain being a thing gives rise to this rich machinery of prediction and prediction error and control. So just to summarize this last bit then, and I think I've already hinted at this, but the reason this is particularly relevant for consciousness is that these different kinds of prediction explain why different perceptions are the way they are. Visual perception underpins visual prediction underpins visual perception. We see objects in places because that's what matters. That's what visual predictions are all about. Interoceptive predictions underpin embodied experience, how well things are going. Things going badly? Am I anxious? Am I out of running over time? Or not? Those have a very different qualitative character, but I think it all comes down to the different kinds of predictions at play. And this brings us back to where we started, this idea of self-change blindness. I experience myself as relatively stable over time, even given good photographic evidence for the contrary. Why is this? It's happening, right? But why is it happening? Well, I think one reason for this is that if the predictive perceptions in my brain that are geared towards keeping me alive, for them to work well, they basically expect me to stay stable They expect me to not change over time. The stability of the self becomes a self-fulfilling prediction, because to remain stable, to remain alive, I predict myself to not change. We are subjectively blind to the changing self for this reason. And this applies not only, and this is conjecture, this is not, I'm not trying to say this is like, oh, we've got this experiment proves this. No, I think it makes sense, and it's the way I've come to think. And it applies not only to these basic experiences of just being a body, but to all our experiences of being a self. There's something very useful if the brain is trying to keep the body going for a long time. To experience the self as unified, as stable, is a good way to make sure that what the organism does is always drawn to that as the most likely outcome. So the subjective stability of the self as a whole becomes a self-fulfilling prediction. We predict ourselves into existence. So let me just wrap up where we've been. What we consciously see depends on the brain's best guess about the causes of sensory signals. The rubber hand illusion and other experiments of this sort hints that this applies not just to the world around us, but to the self. But of course, we have suggestibility and all these other explanations too. But the experience of self is also a thing. And that the predictions that matter for the body are not just predictions about the body as an object, but about controlling and regulating the internal physiological states of the body. This means to me that all our perceptions, they're all grounded fundamentally in this imperative to stay alive. These predictive mechanisms that arose over evolution and development all have their origin in this primary imperative to keep the body going. We perceive the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. This means, again, that consciousness actually is really quite closely related to life. It's not just a historical analogy anymore. There's a close relationship between being alive and being aware. And this is where we can finally bring up Descartes, who always has to make an appearance in any talk on consciousness. But it's not because of his dualism here. It's more because of what he said about the relationship between life and mind. And he said about other animals, and I always feel bad about giving him stick because he was living at difficult times and he was brilliant, but he did say this about animals. Without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. So being alive was irrelevant to the sorts of rational conscious minds that humans had. Now I think it's entirely the other way around. Conscious selfhood arises because of, not in spite of, our beast-machine nature. Now I'll finish in the last couple of minutes with just a couple of implications from this that are drawn out in more detail in the book, of course. One is free will. Free will is something that, we can talk about consciousness and how mysterious it is, but free will sometimes seems another level of mystery altogether. Does it depend on whether the world is deterministic or not? Well, free will is just another kind, in my view anyway, free will is just another aspect of the perceptions that make up being a self. It's the perception of being the core, it's the perception of making actions that appear to come from within. When we experience a freely willed action, it feels as though we're making something happen that needn't have happened, or I could have done differently, or the world, I'm intervening in the universe in some way. That doesn't mean that that's actually true. In the same way that when I experience red, it doesn't mean that redness is really there in the world. It means that's my brain's way of making best sense of what's going on. Voluntary actions are real. We do things that have mainly internal causes, but there's no need to postulate some uncaused cause that swoops in from wherever and changes the causal structure of the universe. That is spooky nonsense. The second implication is that we all see the world differently. Now, we know this a little bit at the extremes. We might say somebody with psychosis or somebody with synesthesia or something that experiences colors when they see black letters. But I think we all experience the world differently. And that difference is often unseen to us. It's hidden because we use the same words often to describe the same things. But those things as they appear to us are going to be subtly different. We inhabit our own unique inner universe. And beyond the human, there's a vast space of other minds. I spent a week with octopuses back in 2009, which was one of the most amazing weeks of my scientific life, and I write about this too. When you spend time with octopuses, you realize that the particular way that we experience being a self just doesn't apply to a creature as alien as the octopus that can taste with its suckers, and that its arms are almost like autonomous animals, and it also has 3 hearts and jet propulsion and blue blood. So they're very strange. And finally, there's the prospect of intelligent machines. Some people think that as AI continues to get smarter and smarter, there'll just come a point where the lights come on and it becomes conscious. Now, I don't think this is true at all. If consciousness is tightly bound up with being alive, that's what matters. Consciousness is not the same thing as intelligence. That's just part of our human-centered hubris, where we think we're intelligent and we're conscious. The two must go together. You don't have to be sentient to suffer. No, you don't have to be smart to suffer, but you may have to be alive. I love this Alex Garland film Ex Machina, which explores these ideas about when we infer consciousness in other things. So if we are worried about creating consciousness artificially, perhaps we should be more worried about things like brain organoids, this new neurotechnology where people are growing brain-like structures in a dish. This is rapidly advancing. And there was a paper that I just saw the other day with a conscious organoid here. It didn't actually do that, and that was my sort of messing around with Keynote yesterday. But this organoid actually has light-sensitive pits, the beginnings of eyes, and the neurons within it respond. Now, these are still relatively simple, but they're made out of the same stuff. They're not made out of silicon. So one whole big unknown about what it takes to be conscious just isn't there anymore. With my colleagues Tim Bain and Marcello Massimini, we've written about the prospect of islands of awareness. And there's another case with Michael Carter, who's here as well, where we think about patients who basically have had operations that leave a hemisphere of their brain alive but disconnected within the skull. And on that cheery note, I'll just return to the core message, which is that we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. And before closing, I would really like just to thank, this is of course, the way all the work that's happened in the lab has been done by other people, and I've been so fortunate to work with a brilliant lab over the last 10 or 15 years at Sussex. But it's also shaped the way I think about everything too. It's not just the experiments, the ideas that have all come as a collective. So I want to thank everybody I've worked with. And the last thing I'd say is that I know it's a bit unusual, but the book is dedicated to my parents, of course, but I just wanted to dedicate this particular talk to a former PhD student of mine, Paul Chorley. Paul died in 2013, shortly after finishing his thesis. And some of you here might remember him a bit. He was a lovely man and a brilliant intellect too. And he's sadly missed, and I wanted to keep his memory alive a little bit. So this talk is for Paul. And I'll leave you with this summary of everything, and thank you very much.